Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law Section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome to Our Curious Amalgam, the podcast from the American Bar Association Antitrust Law Section. My name is Christina, and today's topic is, can they really do that? The use of advanced analytics by antitrust and consumer regulators. Data is information, and information can be a very powerful tool and valuable asset. And never before has there been so much of it amassed, collected, and analyzed. Regulators globally are using data to conduct better investigations and simultaneously refining their analyses to understand whether and how data can be used to distort markets or harm competition. Today, we learn how the UK's Competition and Markets Authority, or the CMA, is working through these issues. Joining me today is my co-host, Matthew Hall. Hi, Matthew.
Hi, Christina. It's good to be back.
Good to have you. So what are we talking about today?
Well, we're going to discuss the work of the UK Competition and Markets Authority's Data, Technology and Analytics, or DATA unit. The UK CMA is the UK's main competition or antitrust and consumer protection regulator. And DATA's, or the unit's aim, is to support the broader CMA with a technical understanding of working with data and technology and using algorithms. And I think it's fair to say that data is one of the leading such units within a competition and consumer regulator worldwide.
And why is it important to understand sort of what these regulators are doing on these issues?
Well, from the outside, as an advisor or a company, I think it's important to understand what these types of units can do. They're relatively new, as we're going to learn. I think the data unit within the CMA is really showing the way forward in terms of what it can do in terms of collecting and manipulating data and understanding the technology. And I think it would be a bit strange now if the CMA wasn't trying to be fully conversant in this area. And also, I think looking forward, it's interesting to talk, if we can get onto it, about what future work data may do, for example, in terms of big tech regulation and how that is going to play out.
Yeah, certainly a hot topic these days. And who is our guest today?
Well, we are very pleased to have Stefan Hunt, who is the Chief Data and Technology Insight Officer at the Data Unit of the UK CMA. He's been there since August 2018. Previously, he was head of Behavioural Economics and Data Science at the UK Financial Conduct Authority, or FCA, which is the UK's financial services regulator. He holds, amongst other degrees, a PhD in economics from Harvard University. Welcome, Stefan.
Really good to be here.
Well, thank you. We gave a brief introduction to data, but maybe you could just briefly explain what it's about, who works there, and how it was set up.
Yeah, sure. So really we are about making sure that the CMA, as a competent authority for competition and consumer protection, really is at the cutting edge, as it needs to be, to understand what firms are doing, but also make sure that we've got the capabilities ourselves, so that we can use technology and best data techniques ourselves. So back in 2017, the organization realized that it was starting to need these capabilities. A lot of the times when we're looking at diagnosis in particular market studies, say, or when you're looking at merger cases, actually having more of an understanding of the nature of the technologies at hand would be helpful. And that also is really important as well when we come to remedies as well. If we're going to have effective remedies, it's really important to understand the underlying technologies. So with that in mind, they started to recruit for my position. And as Matthew already mentioned, I joined in just over a couple of years ago now. And as soon as after I arrived, started thinking obviously about what more did we need, and started hiring fairly quickly. So actually by February 19, we already had data scientists surviving into the team. And over the next year or so, we grew to a little under 30. That was data scientists, data engineers. We've got a very small behavioral insight team, so behavioral science related disciplines, and also a team that we call Data and Technology Insight, who are basically conversant in technology, but very happy to write qualitative reports and these kind of things. So that's the kind of makeup of the team.
So it's interesting to note there, I think, Stefan, that you're not looking at economists and lawyers and case officers. These are data scientists who are really specialists in data manipulation and understanding this technology.
That's broadly right. So actually, we did make sure that we did a little bit of internal hiring. So we actually had 5 people join the team who already, of course, had specific interests in data science and data engineering, but they came from other parts of the CMA. That was really important for making sure that we could be as fluent as possible in understanding competition and consumer protection issues, and just obviously knowing how the organization works. Moreover,
you're supporting your role is to support their casework ultimately, isn't it? So you need to have that link.
Yes, it's actually to support casework, and I'm sure we'll touch on this a bit as well. But it's also, I think, to start identifying new cases and actually be part of, in some cases, of leading those cases as well. So the other thing I want to mention, though, is actually once you start going out for data scientists in particular, and you're a competition authority, it turns out that quite a few of those data scientists actually do have an economics background. So that's proven very useful as well.
Absolutely. And I think it's an interesting comment you made about remedies. I certainly at the European Commission level, there's a lot of complaints about Google's remedies and some of its investigations. So I think that is an important part of your work, and hopefully we'll have a brief chat about that later on. But in making sure remedies are actually properly going to solve these cases, because without that, there's not much point in running these cases in a lot of situations.
Yes, I think that's right. And I'll mention briefly there that I think whilst we're not going to focus on it today, we'll focus on the data side. The behavioural science component, I think, is particularly important for remedies. So when I was leading teams at the financial regulator in the UK, as you mentioned, we were developing techniques like the use of randomised controlled trials and these kind of things to really make sure you could test and see whether things were effective or not.
Okay, that's interesting. I think before we touch on some of your work, I'd like to. Well, I mentioned briefly that you're maybe one of the worldwide leading units in this area. Can you talk a bit about what the other regulators around the world in the US and elsewhere are doing in this area, and also how you liaise with these equivalent, with your counterparts, if you like?
Yeah, sure. There's a lot of interesting movement going on globally in this space. And we are, first of all, I say very broadly, we are really trying to connect on this. Because it's a new area, because we're learning rapidly, authorities have got potentially very large gains from cooperation. Moreover, we get, in some ways, we can benefit from a lot of the same forces that are affecting the technology firms that we're considering, because much of what my unit does is write code. And as we know, as we discuss a lot when it comes to competition, the marginal cost of code is zero. Now, admittedly, there's a whole bunch of other knowledge transfer costs, but those same forces, I think, can be very relevant to the public sector. So when we're working with other units, there's a whole variety of different units that we're working with. So I think of note, I'll mention 3 to begin, and then we'll continue. So the Canadians have just set up a digital enforcement unit under George MacDonald, and they're building up their capabilities in the space, and they're actually in the middle of doing a series of very interesting panels focusing on various digital issues. The Dutch authority, the ACM, have got their own group of data scientists and data engineers, and we found those conversations particularly fruitful in a whole variety of areas, which I'm hoping we'll touch on. And also the ACCC as well in Australia. So they've been doing a variety of very interesting work. So in particular, there's one algorithms case, ACCC versus Trivago, was very interesting, but more generally. Then there's also, of course, in the US, the FTC. So they've got OTEC that some people may be aware of under Joe Calandrino. We're working with Joe Calandrino. And also they've got a very good tech lab that we're, I'd say, slightly envious of, and certainly looking to try to learn from what our colleagues in the FTC are doing. And also the DOJ has capability as well. But there's beyond that, there's now within the Commission, there's the Digital Investigations and Artificial Intelligence Working Group, so across the whole of the European Union. And there's also there's a data scientist in Italy. We've received visits from the Singaporeans, the Danish, the Romanians. The Swiss have got an interesting unit. The Spanish have got their own unit. So we're seeing a lot of activity.
So it sounds like there's a huge amount of international collaboration within this area. And you mentioned, I think, the marginal cost of copying code is zero. Does that mean that you're sharing code? You're not selling the CMA's code to?
So that's certainly one thing we'll have to think about more. And we haven't actually shared any code as stands, but I'm personally quite keen to. I think there's very marked benefits if we can move to more of those kind of models. So obviously has some similarities to open sourcing code, but of course this would be only partially open on the most part.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on to some of Data's your unit's work over recent years. I know you often put your work into a number of buckets, so I think we'll start in that way, if you don't mind. I think the first bucket I identified was what I've seen referred to as data gathering and manipulation. I know you've done a lot of work with the digital advertising market study carried out by the broader CMA here, which was basically a study into Google and Facebook. There was some interesting work you did there, which I think would not have been possible without Data's expertise and abilities. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that is right to say. So in this particular case, we were obviously looking at digital advertising, but an important component of that is search advertising, as we know. And the two leading firms are Google and Bing. And we wanted to really understand two different things. So one was the quality of search results that firms are able to provide. And also we wanted to understand like-for-like comparisons for prices. Is Google able to have higher prices? So on the first of those, cow comparison, what we were able to do was take a whole week's worth of search data from both Google and Bing. So this is quite a large amount of data. It's about 0.5 terabyte. Moreover, because there's the potential for private information to be within the searches, things had to be hashed in a particular way. So we couldn't actually see what the search terms were, but we could compare directly the search terms within Google and Bing. And this allowed us to look at the full array of search terms and say, for example, if we get to the 30% least common search terms within Google, what percentage of those search terms does Bing also see? Because we can compare like for like, but we can do exactly the same for Bing as well. And what we found, there was a over 30-fold difference between what Google can see in the tail of Bing versus what Bing can see in the tail of Google. So really a marked difference. And allied to that, we could then start looking at advertising prices. We could compare exactly the same searches that occur in Google and occur in Bing and see what the prices were. And we could see from that, and this is really holding everything else constant, there was 30% higher prices in Google compared to Bing.
So Google was seeing a very significant proportion of Bing's tail searches, but not the other way around. And presumably that was providing a significant advantage to Google from training its algos to work better even on those very long tail searches. Is that the conclusion from that?
Yeah. Yes. Yes, that's right. We didn't go very deeply into the nature of the algorithms, but just by looking at the data, we were able to show these quite powerful results. In particular, of course, by looking at prices, we're able to show something as on a final outcome as well.
Right, absolutely. All right, and I think you've also done a lot of work in the early days on COVID, when you had the CMA was faced with a flood of information coming in. A lot of it on the consumer side. We were just discussing, it was really a competition study, but the consumer side obviously came right to the fore at the beginning of the COVID situation. And I know that there was a COVID task force set up, and people were actively encouraged to make submissions about their local shops and hand sanitizer. So I think you saved the day there as well, didn't you?
Well, we were part of actually quite a large percentage of the CMA was involved at some point, but we received over 100,000 complaints directly from consumers, and as you can imagine, that's far more than humans can interrogate, certainly in real time. And in some ways, the most basic thing we did was make sure that we had a data pipeline that could take in that data, was dealt with it in a very careful way. So we had a whole variety of code in order to kind of process that data, and that we were always very carefully using the same data that come at certain points in time. We would always get the same results. We're not doing different pieces of analysis off of the fundamentally same data. So there could be a single version of truth, which is actually very important, and it's actually quite easy not to do this. And so once we got this robust data pipeline, we then have to do a whole variety of things to, some of which use some quite advanced machine learning techniques, so deduplication, so that we can understand which firms were really being complained about a lot. We also had to be able to understand what sector complaints were in. So we built a machine learning model that could allocate these complaints to different sectors. If we stand back more generally, so that having these capabilities is obviously very new for competition authorities. And it's actually important very much outside of this kind of one-off situation, when we're trying to think about building evidence for cases, and let's say we're scraping lots of data, as I suspect we're going to, what we've been doing quite a lot, and I think authorities are increasingly going to be scraping data to build evidence for cases. We have to think about how do we do that in ways that can really carefully build evidence for cases. So I think this kind of careful data engineering work will be very important.
Maybe that's a good segue into the next. I think the next bucket that's often talked about is analysis and insight. And here, again, on the consumer side, there's been a lot of work in the UK, as you know, on fake and misleading reviews. And I think the data unit, fake and misleading online reviews, I think the data unit has really been able to step up and massively increase what the CMA was previously able to do in relation to first identifying and then just manipulating and recording these fake online reviews.
Yes, I think that's right. But we're working very much very closely with our consumer colleagues who are doing work before we started actually, and we've been working very closely with. There are a variety of different inputs, but I do think the data science input is very important. So there's really two sides to the case. So the first side was dealing with marketplaces. So in particular, eBay and Facebook, where what we're seeing on eBay originally was literally just buying and selling of fake reviews. On Facebook, there's all these different groups where it could be there's a variety of different types of behavior. It wasn't just always very simple buying and selling, but there was certainly some various types of concerning behavior. So in the case of the marketplaces, which was the first part of the case, what we were able to do there was, because this was the early part, we had to really focus on the conversations between the CMA and the platforms, and make sure we had data scientists as part of those conversations, and they're able to really understand the technicalities of how different platforms will be checking their sites to make sure that there won't be any concerning activity. And that was very important for driving those conversations forward, for making sure that we had assurance that the commitments we were having from the firms were going to be strong, as we were alluding to earlier when it came to remedies. Now, on the second side of the case, which is the review sites, that's where the work was a bit different, where we were. So originally, our consumer colleagues had done some really excellent investigative work where they'd been looking at different reviews, but it was manually within Excel. And they'd look at the different reviews and then they'd record things. But we actually had this fantastic data engineer join literally his first afternoon on the job. He literally wrote Python code to scrape the site and actually do what the consumer team had been doing, but doing it automatically through code. And of course, once you've got that, if we so wanted, that means we could do what our colleagues had been doing manually 100 times, 1,000 times, 100,000 times. You can start scaling very considerably. And once you start having the data, you can start using a whole variety of different techniques to interrogate it. So in fact, we were able to use things like graph analytic models and these kind of things to detect problems. And actually, there was two aspects. So one was it really enables us to understand what do these review sites need to be doing in order to detect fake reviews, which is a very hard problem. But moreover, we actually did determine a whole number of issues as well that the consumer team were able to use as part of the case and really help them decide which review sites should we include within the case and what should our strategy be on that case as well.
Okay, that's interesting. There's so much more to talk about. I know you've done so much interesting work, but I wanted to look a bit towards the future. Looking a bit into the future. You mentioned briefly your behavioral work, but just when I was preparing for this, I saw that, and I know that you do existing work on this already, but some of the things you're looking to do in the future are in particular, well, the first topic we can maybe mention is the use of algorithms. I think the CMA has mentioned that there's an upcoming CMA paper on the subject, and presumably you're going to be inputting a lot into that. Is there anything you can talk to us about that, Stefan, at this point?
Sure. So we're certainly thinking about putting out a paper as we've been investigating this area. We feel like we've been learning and understanding a lot. Now, I think the first thing to say before we get into the ways that algorithms can cause harm, I think we really do need to emphasize and re-emphasize how important algorithms are and the very vast array of positive benefits. So if we think about curation algorithms, for example, if we think about social media feeds, if we think about news or these kind of things, these products just wouldn't be possible without algorithms. So we think about repricing thousands of products. If we think about Uber or other gig economy websites. So first of all, very important. But there are a variety of theories of harm that involve algorithms. Now, the competition community has focused quite a lot on various different theories of harm to do with collusion. But actually, we see a lot of focus in other communities. So let's say the artificial intelligence community, where there's a lot about various different elements of discrimination. I mentioned curation algorithms, which are really prominent. Well, curation algorithms aren't fundamentally focused on price. They're focused on what you see and in what order and these kind of things. So when we start thinking about these kind of issues, you realize there's a whole variety of other theories of harm, and I'm not going to steal my own thunder too much, that we could think about how they relate to the remit or not of competition and consumer agencies. But a couple of other things as well. So first of all, really think about the methods. So I mentioned the ACCC Trivago case I think briefly earlier, which was to know the particular algorithm. Actually understanding how do you build up evidence for these cases, I think is important, and how do we test theories of harm. And then moreover, as we've been going through this journey ourselves, making sure that we've got the capabilities, it helps us really think about, well, what can and should ourselves and other authorities be doing to make sure we do have the capabilities to intervene where there is harm in this kind of area.
Okay, well, there's a lot to look at there. I think you mentioned earlier the behavioral work. I think this is one of the things you're looking forward. Is one of the things you're going to be focusing on. I know you have psychologists within the team as well. Is there anything you, and as you said, it's relevant to remedies. Is there anything you can say more in that area on how you're developing the team, what kind of things you're thinking about on the behavioral?
Sure.
That's
yeah. So definitely one of the main areas I think that we can use for behavioural is going to be in sort of diagnosis and building evidence for cases. So when you try and think, at least from the point of view of economic theory, when you try and think about a lot about the issues that we see in consumer protection, if we're going to try and identify a market failure that is happening, it's none of the kind of classic market failures. These are behavioural market failures. The fact that we're humans and not automatons mean that we struggle to make decisions in a variety of different ways. And again, from the economic framework, that's very important for thinking about the problems at hand. So we've certainly been involved with our consumer colleagues, and I can see this happening also with our competition colleagues as well. There's been some involvement in digital advertising. I can see much more happening in the future, and thinking about diagnosis, but then very much about remedies. How do we understand the variety of what's available and testing them? A broader area I'd like to point to is, I was touching on curation algorithms already, though this is slightly broader, is online choice architecture. And whilst this, again, similar to algorithms, has lots of potential use for good, when people are not able to make choices fully in their own best interests, we have to at least be aware of the fact that people could be led to make decisions that are beneficial more for firms and not for themselves, and the variety of different ways that may have issues. So we're also thinking quite hard about this, the broader issues of online choice architecture, and also where the gaps lie. Well, where do we need to understand more as an authority?
Great, Stefan. That's a phenomenal amount of work that you guys have done together, and much has been done and much to be done in the years to come, both at the CMA and globally. Before we let you go, we always like to ask all our guests 2 questions. The first is, tell us something interesting about yourself that we wouldn't know about you if we just knew you professionally.
Okay, so this has got a professional element to it as well. So I'm an identical twin, and so it turns out we've been doing somewhat different things over the years. We've been influencing each other, but doing different things. But actually, as I've moved into the competition space, he's actually in the competition space as well. So that's been an interesting for our paths to be crossing quite as much as they do.
Also at data, or just at the CMA generally?
No, he's an economist working in the private sector for a firm.
Very interesting dinner conversations, I'm sure you both have. And what advice do you have for students or younger lawyers looking to do what you do?
Okay, that's interesting. So for me, for lawyers, I guess I'll focus it on my space. If you are interested in the platforms and digital firms, I do think there's a lot of value to being understanding some of the technologies that these firms are using. So quite a bit of it's public. So whether we go Google or Facebook or these different organizations. So actually, whether it be through Twitter or whether it be through other forms. Following a few of the prominent people within, say, DeepMind or Facebook or these kind of things, I think can actually really help you understand the nature of, the core nature of what some of these firms are doing. And I think it's interesting besides.
And I guess also a follow-up to that is for data scientists and the like, I know that's becoming a sort of hot major within universities. Any recommendations for data scientists looking to get into the competition space?
One thing to do would be really focus on natural language processing techniques. In general, they're very useful, but especially because competition authorities ultimately have purchased through the law. Just a huge amount of what we do is within cases, and obviously by the time cases get to court, will be involved in processing data. So building up capabilities in that particular area, and this is just an area that's just booming right now, I'd say would be my number one tip.
Great. And now for our final segment, what we call the Curious Hat.
And now it's time for the Curious Hat.
So Stefan, in normal circumstances, we'd all be live in a studio and we'd be able to hand you a hat and you'd pick out a number. Obviously, we're all virtual these days. If you could pick a number 1 through 25, I will ask the question.
Number 7.
Number 7? 10. 7? Sorry, did I hear correct?
It's 7, yes.
7, okay. What was your very first job?
Oh, my very first job. So from the age of 12, I was delivering newspapers. 6 in the morning. We worked 364 days a year when we were on holiday. So getting up in the morning and working hard.
Wow, jumping on a bike or?
No, door to door. At least in London or most European cities, you can normally walk around.
Great. And what is one job you always wanted to have but likely won't have?
So, I think it might have been really interesting to get involved maybe in some political parties a bit more, being a part of kind of elections or anything like that. I think would have been a really interesting thing to have done for a while, I think.
Well, you're not too far off with data, certainly working for the government. But Stefan, thank you again for your time today. This has been incredibly interesting. And thanks all for listening in to this episode of Our Curious Amalgam.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org. Antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.